morning, everyone. Uh, in continuation to the last class about morbidity indicators, let's talk about mortality indicators today, right? Just to sort of give you an idea, so each year death information is analyzed and the resulting tabulations are made available by each government. So this particular data of deaths or mortality provides the starting point for many epidemiological studies. So how is this done? This is basically done by analyzing the death certificates wherein you have the cause of death written. So there is this analysis from the vital statistics division within the government which actually looks at the various causes of death. But if you don't have a proper cause of death mentioned in the death certificate, then the problem starts in terms of what is the cause of death and things like that. Because many a times the cause of death is written as cardiorespiratory failure, and what is the next level second cause of death or the tertiary cause of death is not written. So what are the limitations of the mortality data? If you basically look at the government related data, or many times the data of death that is available, you see that there is an incomplete reporting of deaths. Many a times there are a lot of things, information which is missed in the death reporting. A lack of accuracy, because everybody's cause of death is written as cardiorespiratory failure. I'm sure most of the people die because of cardiorespiratory failure itself, but there's no specific primary cause of death. Lack of uniformity, and the death certificates vary from various state to state, and also in terms of the information that is available. Some places you have the name and age and sex, some places you have the address also given, some places you have primary, secondary and tertiary cause of death, but some places you just have one cause of death. So things like that. So there is lack of uniformity, and there is always a limitation in terms of choosing one single cause of death. That's the reason why most of the deaths are sort of say classified as cardiorespiratory failure. That's one problem in terms of putting up what is the single cause of death. So what is the uses of the mortality data? Basically mortality data will explain the overall trends in the population. So it will tell us in terms of what were the trends of road traffic accidents and deaths because of that, or it can even tell us in terms of what are the types of diseases through which mortality has occurred, and it gives us a trend. So has the traffic accidents death decreased compared to the last year to this year, or is there a trend of an increase of deaths due to traffic accidents over a period of time, which is logical to think about because we have more traffic coming in, more people having vehicles and more vehicles on the road, so probably it is causing more traffic accidents, and we can probably look at the data and see how the trend goes in terms of what is the trend of death in 2000 and then till 2010 and to 2020. Has there been an increase in trend of death? So it helps us in terms of identifying the trends. And once we have the trends, we would then probably work in terms of indicating the priorities for health action. So if you list down all the causes of deaths, right, and see which of the types of deaths which are happening more, then it will help us prioritize various conditions or various issues relating to death, and we can do some programs or action we can take in terms of healthcare and stuff like that. There is also this will also give us information in terms of where to allocate resources. For example, I will take a traffic accidents again, and if you see that there has been a continuous trend of increase in deaths because of traffic accidents, we take it as a priority, right? And then once we take it as a priority, what do? We will have to do something about it, right? So for that you need health resources. So for example, you probably want to set up trauma centers, right? So when you want to set up trauma centers, you need to have a trauma center with various equipment, manpower, and the facility itself. So you need resources to do that. Resources in terms of manpower, and money, and machine. If you look at it that way, you need all these three to set up trauma centers, right? And then if you set up a trauma center, but still you need to design an intervention around it. So if you just set up a trauma center, nothing much will happen. But if you actually set up a trauma center and then connect to the police, connect to the traffic police, connect to the ambulance system like 108, and say that okay, these are the places where trauma centers are set up, and if there is an accident in this area, this is the nearest trauma center, you can take them. So that way you can sort of design intervention programs where you can reduce the time lag between reaching the facility from the site of the accident. So mortality rates, basically rates, you have various rates of mortality, and we'll discuss each one of them as we go on. So there is like crude death rate, there is specific death rate, there is case fatality rate, there is proportional mortality rate, there is survival rate, and there is adjusted or standardized rates. So let's take each one of them and try to discuss what they are. Crude death rate. This is basically a simplest measure, and that's why it is called as crude, right? Because it just gives you an overall simplest measure. So number of deaths in the year divided by the population. That's it, simple. So it just gives you a crude idea. But then remember, this crude death rate actually gives you a lot of idea also, because if you see that the crude death rate over the past few years, it has sort of increased, then there is a cause of concern. Then you can investigate further and try to figure out in terms of why is deaths increasing in your area, and then you can take certain measures, then you can ask for certain resources, you can set up certain interventions, and in fact this is one of those reasons where people have looked at the crude death rate, but later on they dig further and then try to figure out in terms of what are the reasons for the death, and then they try to address it. Right? So crude death rate is the simplest measure. Is the number of deaths in a year divided by the median population multiplied by 100 multiplied by 1000. You can take it, because if it is a larger population you multiply it by 1000, or if the number of deaths are very high you multiply it by 1000, but if it is less then you multiply it by 100. So CDR summarizes the effect of two factors: population composition and age-specific deaths. It summarizes. It doesn't give you a breakup of that. So everybody within the population is in that, because we are dividing it by the population, and all the deaths in different ages you put up, and also the age-specific death rate is mixed in it. If you see, death rate is very high in older population, right, and it is also high in the very young population. So these two also are included in it, in the number of deaths. So probably it is going to pull from each side, and whereas the deaths between say 10 years to 40 or 50 years is low compared to people who are dying after 60 years and people who are dying less than 5 years. But it doesn't look into those particular details, but it just summarizes everything together. So next is age-specific death rates per thousand population. So just look at this example. You have a population population of a city or a region and a B region. The crude rate is 15 and then the other one is 10. Right? Now look at the age-specific death rates. So for the population A, you see that there is 13.5 per thousand population of 0 to 1 years deaths, and 59 or almost 60% deaths among the 65+ population. Right? Whereas in population B, you look at that 0 to 1 is around 22% or 23%, and 65 plus is 61%. Right? So, but when you look at this difference, what do you find? You see that there are a lot of people who are dying in 65 plus and less than 1 year in population B. However, the crude death rate is only 9.9%. Why does this happen? Because if you just look at crude death rate without looking at age-specific death rates, then you would say population B is faring better, because it has only 9.9 per thousand deaths, right? Whereas crude death rate of population A is not good, because it is 15.2% people out of 1,000 are dying. So the population in B appears healthier than A. Right? Population B has higher age-specific mortality rates. Right? But when you look at the crude death rate, you can say that population B appears to be healthier than A, right? Naturally, it's 10 versus 15. And you will say that population B has higher age-specific rates. Yes, we looked at it. 0 to 1 is higher, and also 65 is higher. Higher CDR in A is due to its older population. probably the number of people in the population A in the older population age group is higher, right? The total numbers is higher, and this is the prevailing situation in most of the developing countries, right? We'll go back to the slide again and just give you an example, just give you this particular thing. So the 9.9 and 15.2 is arrived because of the numerator and the denominator. If you have a higher population, the crude death rate will be lower. Whereas if you have lower population, your crude death will be higher. So probably that's one scenario in A and B. But at the same time, you can also see that the age specific rates are much higher in B, right? So probably there is not much of dilution here in terms of population, but there is probably a dilution because of the averaging of it, the total number of deaths per day. So most of the developing countries, the situation is something like the population B. You might have a low crude death rate, but very high age specific death rates. So you got to dig deeper. You got to dig deeper and find out what actually is happening within the age, within the sex, within different type of population, within different race, within different conditions, right? Some of those stuff. Disadvantages of crude death rate is lack of comparability for communities with population that differ by age, sex, and race. That's what we just told, right? So you cannot just when you simply compare crude death rate of, let's say, India versus Italy. I'll give you an example in terms of COVID-19 itself. We saw that Italy had so many deaths, right? Why was it? And there were all these people who were analyzing the data and who were saying that the most of the population in Italy, the larger chunk of population in Italy were older than 65, and probably they are more vulnerable to get severe infection and die, and probably that's the reason why there are more number of people who are dying. But when you consider India, India is more of a young population currently. We have not transitioned yet as an Asian nation. We do have, in terms of total number, we do have a lot of people in terms of the sheer number. But when you look at the percentage of the population, our percentage is only 8 to 9% of aged population. But whereas in Italy it goes up to almost 15%, right? So there's a difference in that way. So CTR, or the crude death rate, doesn't take into consideration age, sex, or the race of the people, because there are certain races which might be prone for death because of certain conditions. So probably they die young, they die a lot there. So for example, in the African region, there are a lot of death which is happening, right? That's probably because of age, probably because of race, probably because of the other conditions within the country. So many of these factors doesn't take into consideration as a crude death rate. It doesn't take into consideration. So you have to be very cautious when you interpret this, and you have to be very cautious when you compare this with other countries, because there is a lot of these differences that you're trying to compare, and you're trying to sort of group everybody into one similar bucket, saying that the population of India is similar to population of Italy, similar to population of Japan, is similar to population of, say, Uganda, right? It's not. So that's the disadvantage of crude death rate. So specific death rate, the specific death rate is, sort of you can you can sort of divide them into two different ways. One is cost specific death rate, or age specific or sex specific death rate. So anything that you specify in terms of the death rate would be a specific death rate. So cause specific death rate or disease specific death rate is the rate of deaths that is happening due to TB, due to traffic accidents, or due to HIV, due to COVID, that is cost specific. And then whereas when you look at the groups, you say that age specific. So deaths under 5 years old, right? Deaths under 1 year old, deaths more than 65 years old, that is age specific. Sex specific, deaths among men, deaths among women, right? So this is specific death rate. So for example, again, when you look at the specific death rate, you just have to remember that you are taking the specific death cause on the top, on the numerator, and dividing it by the median population. That's it. The number of deaths from TB in that year divided by the median population, or number of males who died divided by the median population, or deaths in a week divided by the median population. We're talking about death in a week into 54 because there are 54 weeks in a year, right? So we're just trying to do it for a year, right? So death in a week into 54 divided by median population. So this is specific death. So compared to crude death rate, the specific death rates give you a bit more better information. It tells you in terms of how many of them are dying specifically because of certain specified cause or specified group or specified duration or specified age group or specified sex group and stuff like that. Now coming to the case fatality rate. Now this is something that you have to figure out and understand well, because case fatality rate is generally used within healthcare institutions or facilities, where they say that how many cases of that disease were there, and out of them how many died due to that disease. So it's a simple calculation. Number of deaths due to that disease divided by number of cases due to the same disease. So for example, there's example of cholera. So 500 deaths out of the people who had cholera, 5,000 people had cholera in AP, let's say at any point of time. This is just a hypothetical example. Out of 5,500 died. The same thing when you come to COVID, you would say that we have 26,000 people, out of which say 900. So that is case fatality rate. So remember that case fatality rate represents the killing power of the disease or the virulence of that particular disease. The higher the virulence, the higher the death rate. Right? So that's why many a times we try to sort of look at case fatality rate as an indicator for virulence of a particular disease or a virulence of a particular organism which causes the disease. And it is the ratio of deaths to cases. So there's basically ratio of deaths divided by cases. Most of the time case fatality rate is used in acute diseases, acute infectious diseases to an extent, but I would say acute diseases. So what happens, especially when you go on to use case fatality rate in chronic conditions, the problem with chronic conditions is even though you have the disease, the cause of death might not be that disease. Say for example, you take up a guy who has hypertension, or you take up a population which has hypertension on the denominator. Let's say 1,000 people have hypertension. How many people would have died because of hypertension over the past 20 years or 30 years? It becomes very difficult, right? Because hypertension is not primary cause of death, but what would it lead to? It will lead to atherosclerosis, it will lead to cardiovascular disease, it will lead to myocardial infarction, it might lead to chronic kidney disease, it might lead to other complications because of it. So it becomes very difficult when you're looking at a chronic case or a chronic disease to calculate case fatality rate, because the chronicity, the duration with which the person has the disease, actually imposes a lot of other confounders into it. Say for example, in a very crude example, a person who's let's say there are 1,000 people who are having hypertension in the community, out of which 30 died. Right? So 30, how did they die? 5 of them died because of road traffic accident. Out of 25, 5 died because of MI, 10 died because of stroke, and 5 died because of chronic kidney disease. So it becomes very difficult in terms of how are you going to attribute to that particular case, right? So you cannot. So that's why most of the time case fatality rate is used mostly in acute infectious disease, where the course of onset, incubation, onset of symptoms, and course of the disease is so short that we know that this whole complexity has come in because of that particular infection. You can take an example of the COVID itself. A person who gets the COVID infection, many of them will be asymptomatic, but on those who are symptomatic, there might be some portion of the people who end up having a lot of complications into ICU, into ventilators, and they die, right? So case fatality rate of COVID would be easier to find out when you say that we had diagnosed 1,000 cases, out of which say 40 died. Right? It's easier. You can attribute the cause of death to that particular infectious disease. That's why. There are other examples in terms of food poisoning. There might be instances where there are like 500 cases of food poisoning, out of which 2 or 3 of them died. Cholera, it's again the same. You know the course of the disease, cholera occurs, and because of cholera dehydration, some people die. So it's easier for you to do it. So case fatality rate, its usefulness for chronic disease is limited because the period from onset to death is long and variable, and you have a lot of other confounding factors which come into play in that particular thing. Proportional mortality rate. So proportional mortality rate basically expresses the number of deaths due to a particular cause per 100 total deaths. Say, for example, in a community there are like 1000 deaths. Out of these 1000 deaths, if you want to figure out how many of them actually died because of COVID, so that's what is proportional mortality. So you pick the denominator as the number of deaths, not total deaths, and on the numerator you put up saying that people died because of COVID. So that's proportional mortality rate. So number of deaths from a specific disease in that year divided by the total of deaths from all causes in that year. So this is very important, right? So you can always try to sort of look at one of these examples that is given here is train accidents, proportional mortality rate due to train accidents in India. 50,000 deaths in a year, out of which 500 deaths were because of train accidents. So proportional mortality is proportional to the total deaths in that particular region in that particular year, and on the numerator we will have the specific death. Another example is proportional mortality rate under age 5. So you look at the number of deaths under 5 years of age divided by the total number of deaths in the same period. So that way you sort of try to figure out how much is the proportion of this particular cause contributing to the total deaths. This is very, very important, especially when for policymakers, for decision makers, because they would like to understand the burden of the disease. If a disease is not causing deaths, probably it's causing morbidity to an extent, let's forget about it at this point of time. But if a disease is causing proportionally very high number of deaths, that will become priority of the government to act on. Say for example, some disease like COVID itself. If it was so, COVID is not a right example. So you're trying to follow up the trends of population, and then why India started looking at non-communicable disease as a priority intervention, because many till I think late 2000 we were thinking that non-communicable diseases were diseases of the urban and elite people. But then we realized as we moved on, we started seeing that the proportional death of the people dying because of non-communicable disease was increasing. And in a given point in time, they contributed almost 20 to 25% of the deaths. So that becomes very important. You say that 1 out of 4 deaths, or 1 out of 4 or 5 deaths in the country is happening because of non-communicable diseases. Now this is something which is important that we have to address. Right? So that's how the gravity of the problem is understood by most of the decision makers or policy makers. So, proportional mortality rate is computed usually for communicable diseases and for specific diseases of major public health importance like cancer, coronary artery disease, non-communicable disease, etc. And we can also look at proportional mortality rate, especially in terms of people who are aged 50 years and above. So if we see that out of the total deaths, how many of them were more than 50 years old? And if we see that is high, then we have to invest very heavily on geriatric care. Right? People should not just die because they are aged. So we'll have to figure out some of those things. So it's basically helpful for both infectious diseases and also non-infectious or non-communicable diseases. This gives a good idea in terms of the burden of disease. The survival rate. So what is survival rate? Where is survival rate usually used? I'm sure many of you would have heard about it, but let's discuss about it. So it's basically proportion of survival in a group of patients followed over a period of time. It is a method of describing prognosis of the disease. Now at least with these two things I'm sure you will understand. Survival rate is mostly used for certain fatal diseases like cancer. So cancer survival rate. So you pick up the proportion of the people having the specific cancer, and then you follow them up for a period of 5 years, and then see how many of them survive with treatment, with whatever types of treatment that you have. So generally in cancer we talk about 5 years survival rate. So how it is calculated? You have total number of patients alive after 5 years divided by the total number of patients who were treated or identified. So this is very important in terms of a measure for the healthcare, in terms of how properly are you providing care for people who are having cancer, and how much proportion of the people survive after 5 years having that specific cancer. So So survival rates have received special attention in cancer studies, and now it has become the norm, especially in terms of looking at survival rates within cancers. Because cancers are generally fatal, they metastasize, and then there's a lot of problems in terms of prognosis. So if you're able to extend the duration of survival of each patient, then you can say indirectly that your healthcare services are better. So higher the survival rate among cancer patients, the better is your healthcare system. So it's now received a lot of importance and attention in cancer related studies or cancer related care itself. Now adjusted or standardized. So this is something that probably you should pay a bit of attention, because you're standardizing the mortality rates by one or two different methods. There is a direct standardization, there is an indirect standardization. So I'll try to tell you what is direct standardization first. So in a direct standardization, a standard population is defined as one for which the numbers in each age are known, and then national population is usually taken as standard population. So what happens is, you do a study. I'll show you the example. First step, standard population is selected, say the national population or something. Age composition is known, because when you have the national population, you basically have to know the age composition also. And then age specific rate is applied on standard population, whose crude death rates to be registered or standardized. As a result, for each group, an expected number of deaths in the standard population is obtained, and those are added for all the age groups to give total expected deaths. And then what you do is, you divide the expected by the total number of deaths of the total sample. This is a standardized rate. So expected divided by the total death. Say this is what it is, right? So for city X, right? So what happens is, you take up the population. So this is basically the population where you have studied 53,500 people, and you had deaths of 446, and in each age group you have age specific death rates. So this is a study of 53,000 people that you have done, and you have found out that total deaths is 446, and age specific death rates are like 15, 4, 21, 55.5, 4 years, and things like that. Then what you do is, then you go ahead and put it to a standard population. So you pick up a population of the country, pick up a population of the region, pick up the population of a state or district or whatever, because here this is the study population. So you studied a finite population, right, of 53,500 people. You studied a finite population. Let's assume you studied in a mandal or a small taluk or a block, right? So you studied the death rates age specific. So you studied, and this is what you got. And then you go and take up the whole district's population, and then you divide the age groups, and then multiply the rates, age specific rates that you have got from the study to this population, and then you calculate the expected deaths. So what happens is, actual deaths is 446, expected deaths comes to 609. So you got the difference. So that's what you try to end up. So what you do is, you take up a standard population or a population of a state, district, or a region, and then multiply the rates that you have got from the study to that standard population, and then calculate the expected deaths. So once you get the expected deaths, right, what you do is, you take the expected deaths and divide it by the population, and you can calculate the standardized death rates for that particular population. The crude death rate was 8.3, so 446 out of 53,500. That's what you got. But the standardized death rate per thousand was 609, which you got it by the multiplying the rates of the sample or the finite population that you studied divided by the total population. So standardizing for age distribution has reduced the crude death rate from 8 to 6.5, or from 8.3 to 7. So it is always important for you to think about this, because when you do a study for a finite population or a small sample, and you cannot directly put it to the population. So this is one way that you can do a direct standardization, where you standardize your study rates with the standard population, and then calculate the standardized death rates. So this is direct standardization. So indirect standardization. So standardized mortality ratio is what is also called. The simplest and most useful form of indirect standardization. In fact, one of the places where it is used very heavily, especially standardized mortality rate, for allocation of money to various regions, is in England, where they use the standardized mortality rate for allocating money to that particular region. So, observed deaths divided by expected deaths. It gives a measure of excess risk of mortality due to the occupation. So this basically standardized mortality rate is basically done in terms of a specific occupation or a specific region or something like that. So I'll just tell you what it means. Say for example, okay, just look at this. So observed deaths divided by expected deaths. It gives the measure of excess risk of mortality due to the expected occupation or something like that. So if it is more than 100%, the occupation would appear to carry greater risk. If it is less than 100%, it will be lesser mortality risk. So this is basically done for some of the coal workers. This is one classic example. So what you do is national population death rates per thousand. In those age groups, people from 25 to 64 work in coal mines. So what you do is you take the national death rates of these things, right? So 3, 5, 8, 25. Right? This is the national death rates, and you take up the coal workers population. So they have taken 1,000. So the observed death rate among coal workers, what as per the records, is totally 9. Whereas expected death, you multiply the coal workers population with the national death rate average. So that comes to 7. See, 300 multiplied by 0.03, 400 multiplied by 0.05, 200 multiplied by 0.08, 100 multiplied by 0.25. So if you see that total expected deaths is 7. So now you divide the observed, that is 9, divided by 7. Here the whole understanding or the whole logic is that the people who are working in coal mines should die similar to the people who are not working in coal mines. Okay? They should not. But if they are not dying like that, it means that there is something related to the coal mine that is a problem. So you do this. So you find out observed deaths is 9 and then expected deaths is 7, and now it is 129, right? Multiplied by 100, multiplied by 129. It's more than 100. So this means that go back here, the occupation would appear to carry greater mortality risk than that of the whole population. So coal miners, coal mining shows coal mining has more death rate compared to the compared to the normal population, 129. So basically, if you turn it around, this is the people who are working in coal mines have a mortality of 29% more than the experienced 29% of the national population. So if you're working in coal mine, you have 29% chances of dying more than the natural population that you live in. So this is what it means. 129 is 29%. So this is basically what is indirect standardization or standardized mortality rate. The limitation of it is that it is mostly related to some of the type of work that you do or occupation that you do, and you try to see whether that occupation actually attributes to any higher mortality compared to the general mortality within the population, which is not in the population, which does not include this. There are other standardization techniques in terms of absolute age-adjusted rates. There are life tables, there are regression techniques, there are multivariate analysis, there are other standardization techniques. So absolute age-adjusted rate. So what you do is you take the absolute values of the age specific death rates, and then you compare it directly with the standard population, and then try to create an absolute age-adjusted rates. Life tables, these are life tables which are set up in terms of each person being followed up and based on that. Regression techniques, there are some of these Cox regression and other regression techniques which actually help you to standardize. Multivariate analysis is basically analysis where you try to sort of adjust for various factors. So working in coal mines is one of the factors like that. Somebody who's smoking and working in coal mines is another factor. Somebody who's working in coal mines, smoking, and also has existing lung disorder is another compounding factor. So you have to adjust for all those things and figure out, because probably it might be true that out of 100 people working in coal mines, 80% of it smoke. So is it because of the coal mining work, or is it because of smoking that they're dying? Or you can say that out of 100 people in the coal mines, probably 30-40 of them already have COPD. So is it because of COPD that they are dying, or is it because of coal work that they are dying, or is it because of they working in coal mine they develop COPD and that's when they die? So to understand and to answer all these questions, we can do something like multivariate analysis. So these are some of the other standardization techniques. So that's all that I have for today. I think I've sort of covered a bit about the mortality indicators. It's only a small piece of it. There are a lot of other things that we will discuss as we go on. And if you have any questions, you can always place it out on under the video, and I'll try to address it the next time that I take a class for you. And in the meantime, all of you stay well, stay safe, and stay home. So thank you. Have a good day.